Today on Data Nation, we're joined by three leaders from Colossal Biosciences, a company at the cutting edge of science and technology, using genetics, AI, and data to bring extinct species back to life and reshape the future of conservation. I'm Liberty Vittert, a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and my co-host is Munzer Dale, William A. Coolidge Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Ben Lamm, the CEO and co-founder of Colossal, is a serial entrepreneur building bold solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. Dr. Beth Shapiro, Colossal's chief science officer, is one of the top DNA experts in the world, pioneering ancient genome reconstruction. And Matt James leads the Colossal Foundation, the nonprofit arm of the company, which just partnered with Yellowstone Forever to use AI-powered bioacoustics to protect wild wolf populations in Yellowstone National Park. From resurrecting the direwolf to the challenges of editing ancient DNA, we'll explore how Colossal chooses which species to de-extinct, the massive role data plays in making it possible, and what it all means for the future of conservation. I'm personally looking very much forward to the woolly mammoth coming back. Plus, we'll dive into the ethical questions. Can and should we bring back lost species? And how do we use this technology responsibly?
Ben, Colossal is making de-extinction clearly feel very less like science fiction and more like reality, or is reality. So what inspired the founding of Colossal in the first place, and how did this all come to be?
Well, Colossal didn't start the de-extinction movement. Many people like Beth Shapiro, the great folks at Revive and Restore, George Church, many others have been talking about this concept of using technologies, combination of genome engineering, cellular engineering, computational biology, advanced reproductive technologies, even things like artificial wombs to eventually bring back species or proxies for those species, right? And so Colossal, at least to my knowledge, is the first company that took those concepts and kind of built on what this incredible kind of movement that was already happening in the scientific field was doing to go build a company. And, I really have to credit, folks like George Church, Beth Shapiro, obviously, who's now our chief science officer, George, our co-founder, and many others who really kind of got this idea over the last 10 years going. But it really wasn't till kind of the intersection of AI, computational biology, and synthetic biology, being able to engineer and do directed evolution in life, that this was even a possibility. And so the concept of taking this thing that sounded like science fiction and applying it in an interesting way to, one, bring back these species or proxies for these species, as well as develop technologies that are much needed for conservation, while also inspiring kids, right? Like we get so many people excited about it, was just, it was kind of like the perfect, interesting project to go tackle. And I'm pretty fortunate that a lot of people before us, including Beth and George, kind of got the industry started.
And just to follow up on all that really quickly, I really hope this doesn't sound insulting, because I in no way mean it that way. But
I've
is
got I've got pretty thick skin, so you can say
this
whatever you want to me, right? And so I'm pretty open.
from someone who's non-knowledgeable on this, Jurassic Park is my first thought. Is there the dream that there'd eventually be a Jurassic Park, or the colossal version of that for kids and people to sort of see what our world looked like?
The number one question we get is dinosaurs, right? And we get it every day.
Of course.
Beth gets yelled at because she says it's not possible to bring back a dinosaur. She gets yelled at quite a bit on Reddit. So I don't think that Jurassic Park is in the cards. For us, we aren't as excited about taking these species, bringing them back, and just putting them in captivity. Our focus is really putting them back into the wild or in secure, expansive ecological preserves. For example, our dire wolves, it's not open to the public. We're certified by American Humane Society, and we want to ensure that everything that we do is with the animal in mind. With that said, to your question, we do want to constantly find ways to put science on display and teach kids about science. We're hoping that with this, we inspire more people to want to be everything from geneticists to conservationists and kind of everything in between. And so we're constantly internally talking about ways that we can build content, educate people, start working more and more on the educational front. So I think it's highly likely that while you won't have a colossal Jurassic Park, you will have different ways that we can showcase the science and really put science on display and not just animals on display.
Well, I'm going to jump in. First of all, I'm going to say thank you all for joining us. And I've been learning about this, and it's fascinating. I'm a computer scientist, but I spent 2 years at the Broad Institute learning about DNA and how to, use transcription to kind of transform one type of cell to a different. So we're going to dive a little bit into the technology. But before we do that, and thinking about it just in terms of decisions that you make, how do you decide which extinct animal you're going to go after? I mean, why, what's the limit, and what are the issues that you dabble with when you make a decision of this sort?
Anytime that we think about adding a new species to what we're working on, including species like the direwolf, we really think about, what is the impact to society? What is the impact to a sister species, like in the case of the direwolves, the red wolves, and wolf conservation? How do indigenous people groups of those areas feel about it? What does the government feel about it, right? Are there ecological benefits? Are there scientific breakthroughs that can help conservation? So it's really this like three-dimensional Rubik's Cube that we have to solve before we even jump into a species. Just because we can make a species doesn't mean we will. There's a lot of factors that kind of go into it. And sometimes they're, weighted more than others. Like with the direwolf, we did have a weight on cultural impact. Would this be a way to take people that were excited about sci-fi and fantasy and kids and parents and bring them into conservation and science? I don't know if the thylacine will do that, right? But we thought the direwolf would, and turns out we were overly correct.
Just thinking about this, there's this sort of non-causal sort of way of going about things. I mean, I'm imagining the limit being, why don't we bring back the modern man, Or, there was a reason why we evolved and some species kind of disappeared. But you don't seem to be concerned about this sort of cycle. And maybe it's not a concern. Maybe it's just fiction to think about that we're bringing something from the past, but they were extinct for a reason,
A lot of the species that we're working on, including the species on our conservation list, most people don't realize this because it doesn't catch as much headlines, but we actually do more conservation projects than we do de-extinction projects. Most of the species that we work on, there were anthropologic effects that led to their extinction, right? And so we drove these animals to extinction. And while a lot of the de-extinction efforts, they get most of the headlines, the conservation implications are something that we are constantly spending a lot of time trying to educate the public on. Because the reality is, we're not asking people to move away from conservation or change how they do conservation. We just know that humanity is changing the planet and eradicating species faster than the existing models in conservation can catch up. And so we need new tools in the fight.
It's funny you talk about how excited, sort of picking some of these species is what excites people. Both Munzer and I were talking before we got on with you all, and we both thought dire wolves were science fiction. We didn't even know they were real.
So we actually worked with some of the cast from Game of Thrones, and some of them thought they were fictional as well.
Makes us feel better. But, Beth, I've got to ask you, you all obviously have been so much in the news for your success in bringing back the dire wolf. But, people argue that these young wolves aren't actually dire wolves and that they're just genetically modified gray wolves. So could you tell us sort of how it's possible to clone ancient DNA? Or is the goal to get as close as possible?
The goal is not to clone ancient DNA or to get as close as possible. The goal is to make the fewest number of changes that we can in order to create a healthy animal that has the phenotypes that we intend to bring back. When we talk about de-extinction, we're thinking about functional de-extinction. Once a species is extinct and there aren't any living materials remaining from that species, the DNA inside the cells degrades relatively quickly initially into smaller and smaller fragments. And this means that the process of cloning, the somatic cell nuclear transfer, that process that most famously brought us Dolly the sheep, isn't possible. Once something is gone, it is gone, and we should be focusing our attention on protecting living species and the habitats that they live in, because extinction is forever. But de-extinction, as we think of it, is a mechanism for bringing back some of the traits that defined these species so that we can create ecosystems that retain biodiversity, retain ecological interactions between organisms, and are more robust and resilient because they retain these ecological interactions. So with the direwolf project, we do say that this is a direwolf. It is also a genetically modified gray wolf that has 20 carefully selected genetic edits that are intended to bring back specific direwolf traits, in this case, focusing on things like size and musculature and the light-colored coat that we learned by sequencing the ancient genomes from two fossil animals that lived 72,000 and 13,000 years ago. So we've identified these traits, and we identify the genetic changes that we need to modify in order to bring back these traits. And that is the focus of these de-extinction projects. And the result is an animal that looks like a direwolf, that has these traits. And so we call it a direwolf. And this is following the guidelines in the 2016 publication by the IUCN that I was not a collaborator on, but was an international team of scientists who said that de-extinction is successful when we bring back some semblance of that extinct species. That was our goal, and we succeeded in that goal.
So, if I understand your process, you need a DNA to edit some existing animal. You need some old remnants of old DNA that gives indication of what you're going after. There's an editing process, and this process seems to be different for conservation than for de-extinction. Is that correct? What data do you need, and what are the necessary factors for you to be successful? And what is the difference between how to do this for conservation versus de-extinction?
I actually think that it's the same process. When we're thinking about de-extinction, we're motivated by looking at DNA sequences from an animal that used to be alive. So in this case, we go out into the field, or in the case of the mammoth or the dodo, we go out and we collect the remains of animals that used to be alive. We use the tools of ancient DNA to extract the DNA sequences. They're broken in short fragments and damaged, as is always the case with ancient DNA. We use computational biology to piece together these genomes. We align them to the genome sequences of their closest living relatives, and we ask, where in those genomes are the extinct species different from living species? And in the case of the mammoth, for example, we have more than 100 mammoth sequences. We can ask where all of the mammoths are the same as each other, but different from their closest living relatives, the Asian elephants. And this begins to tell us the list of sequence changes that are necessary to make a mammoth instead of an elephant. You and I have lots of differences between each other. And if we were to say, what are the differences between us, we could clearly say that those are not the changes that make people instead of our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. But where all the people have the same changes, those are the places where we're looking to see what makes humans unique. This is similar to the process we use for ancient DNA. And then we have this long list of sequences, and we have to start to make sense of which of those are actually important for the phenotypes that we're interested in. What of the sequences in mammoths that are all distinct from Asian elephants code for things like thicker layers of subcutaneous fat, or longer hair, or thicker hair, or more hair follicle density, things that will be important to creating that woolly mammoth phenotype in an Asian elephant surrogate genetic background. So we choose these sequence edits that we want to change. In the case of using these tools for conservation, we may not necessarily need to edit DNA. In the case of the red wolf, all we had to do was clone a living red wolf. And then in future, we will use comparative genomics to identify which red wolf pairs we want to put together in order to concentrate red wolf DNA in the animals that are being born today. But in the case of the Black-footed ferret project, which is a project that's a collaborative effort with lots of different organizations that are out there, one of the challenges that they're facing is they want to put genetic resistance to plague, which is one of the things that killing black-footed ferrets, into these genomes. And to do that, they will have to use the tools of genome editing. One of the approaches to this is to identify what it is in the cousin of the black-footed ferret, the evolutionary cousin of the black-footed ferret, the domestic ferret, that makes them resistant to plague, and to move that using the tools of genome engineering into a black-footed ferret genome. And for these reasons, this whole idea of using comparative biology and computational biology to identify what changes we want to make, using the tools of genome engineering in order to make those changes, and then using the tools of cloning and somatic cell nuclear transfer to transform those edited cells into living animals are the same, whether it's a de-extinction project or a conservation project.
Are there situations where you're editing the DNA, but then other consequences emerge where you did not expect, for example, from that particular edit? And so how do you deal with a level of uncertainty about these types of changes?
We have several approaches to deal with uncertainty like this. And, this is obviously one of the hardest problems in biology, mapping a genotype change or a sequence of DNA onto what all of the phenotypic effects are going to be. A good example of this is in the direwolf project. We learned by sequencing the genomes of our two fossil direwolves that both of these animals probably had a light-colored coat based on mutations or variants that are observed in key pigmentation genes. And when we were exploring whether this would be the pathway that we wanted to create a light-colored coat in our direwolves, the proxy direwolves that are edited gray wolves that are alive today, right? The way that we wanted to do this was to make those same edits. But our computational biology team then explores the potential impact of these edits on a gray wolf genetic background. And so we ask, in gray wolves, are there any animals today that have variants in those genes? We do modeling, for example, using the tools of AlphaFold to assess whether the interactions between those genes and other genes might have unintended consequences. We assess whether off-target edits in the same regions of the genome might have unintended consequences and what those will be. We look at gene pathway analyses and figure out what genes are all interacting with each other before we decide that this is an edit that is safe to move on with. In this particular case, we found that the same variants that we observed in our two direwolves, the fossil direwolves, are not present in any gray wolf. But there are variants in those same genes, not the same variants as were in direwolves, but in the same genes, so close enough, that have health impacts for living gray wolves, sometimes blindness and deafness. And so we decide that we will not make those changes, that we can make a light-colored coat phenotype using a different path that we know is safe on the gray wolf background, because there are gray wolves that have light-colored coats. So while we learn the phenotype that we want to make from ancient DNA, in this case, our sophisticated analyses of the impact of those specific genes suggest that it might not be safe to make on a gray wolf genetic background, and we choose a different path. This is, again, what we mean by functional de-extinction.
In terms of your data limitations, which one's sort of harder? Is it getting or extracting the information from the extinct animals? Or is it harder to find, and I'm going to use the wrong word here, the animal that you're going to use as the surrogate for now? So where's the biggest data limitation that you have in this process?
My hypothesis is that the biggest data limitation is in understanding the mapping between the DNA sequence changes and the phenotype that emerges afterward. It obviously uses a lot of space to extract ancient DNA, and there's a ton of data that's produced, and then we have to use a lot of different computational tools to be able to create our ancient genomes and validate these genomes. But the hardest problem that we have is this big, hard problem about large-scale evolutionary comparative genomics and mapping genotypes to phenotypes.
And so in that situation, you mentioned AlphaFold as something that you have utilized. How helpful was that? And tell us more about the computational technologies and other technologies that are playing a critical role in a lot of the advancement that you're seeing.
Well, I mean, the big modeling approaches, all the massive algorithms that are out there using machine learning or AI are obviously helping because they're making our lives easier by being able to throw a ton of information at a computer and allow it to see patterns that a human couldn't otherwise see. I think this is really a space where there's a lot of development right now. There are many, larger machine learning models and AI-based models that are trying to make sense of large scale comparative genomics data sets. There are a bunch of different models, for example, that are trained to predict where enhancers are in genomes or trained to predict where there are going to be motifs that we might consider changing. And we're really thinking about how can we improve these or capitalize on these to make our lives easier. But these are models that are still really in early phases.
So, Matt, I know you all announced that your nonprofit, the Colossal Foundation, is partnering with Yellowstone Forever, really to protect wild wolf populations. And you guys are doing it in this very sort of data forward way. You're integrating, sort of advanced acoustic monitoring technologies, machine learning pipelines, and really this sort of continuous ecological data collection. So, could you talk a little bit more about how you're doing that? And also, what other species are you going to be doing that with? Or is this just with wolves, or does this pave sort of the pipeline for doing this much further?
Yeah, I think this certainly paves the pipeline for us to begin to take this platform we've built and begin to apply it to other species, other problems, other areas of the world. So we met with some folks at the Yellowstone Wolf Project. Dan Staler, who's the lead biologist in Yellowstone, was recording wolf calls. They've been recording wolf calls for the last 30 years, ever since the reintroduction to Yellowstone in 1995. And they always talked about this idea that there is this, data problem. They have loads and loads of data, and they actually have mostly useless data because they have hours of recordings that don't really actually have anything of use to them. Dan Staler had been working with a gentleman named Jeff Reed, who is a software entrepreneur who has retired and begun a passion project of creating better versions of audio recording units, ARUs. And so that's called Grizzly Systems. And the GrizzCam is now this amazing tool where they're able to both pair video and audio recording, use AI to help trigger when to record, use the AI to also filter out data that it doesn't need and not waste space. And now it also has real-time reporting capabilities. So working with GrizzCam, Yellowstone Forever, Yellowstone Wolf Project, we've set out an array of 25 of these GrizzCams across the national park. They're each about 4 kilometers apart from each other in this big grid array. And now we're recording sounds and video and associating sort of the calls of a wolf with the context of what's happening in the area. So we can begin to make those associations between behavior, context within the habitat, and the calls themselves, with this goal that now we can begin to understand what each wolf call might mean. We can even get to the point where we can begin to understand maybe what signature coarse howls a pack might have, which is a really great tool in tracking wolves across space and time. We can now track the wolves without using collaring data, which right now the traditional method is to use a helicopter to go and net and restrain a wolf, put a collar on them, and then set them back out. So there's obvious cost and risk associated with that. And you're limited to how many collars you have. And then we're hoping we might even be able to get down to individual identification. If we could understand what is the specific call of a wolf and we can understand that individual, we can begin to get this high resolution data of movement, of associations between packs, of behavior and reactions to new stimuli within Yellowstone. So it's a really exciting project, unlocking the language of the wolf, which for me, I think is a really powerful tool in helping to anthropomorphize and create compassion for this sort of villainized species that we almost drove to extinction. As we're understanding these technologies, we're now applying them to other projects across the world. So we have an exciting project we'll be talking more about that's going on in Samoa that's helping try to find a species of pigeon that hasn't been located in 13 years. We're helping monitor for other critically endangered species in places like the Sea of Cortez with the vaquita, and try to understand how can we use bioacoustics as the modern tracking tool instead of some of this more collared-based or tagging-based data sets.
So in a way, are you forming a partnership with Colossal and Yellowstone, and Is one more focused on the collection of the data, the other is sort of trying to translate that data into models and solutions? And what do you think about how impactful that is going to be on the conservation?
We're looking for long-term relationships, and Yellowstone is an icon of conservation, conventional conservation. Right? It's the world's first national park. One of the most bold reintroduction programs ever occurred here 30 years ago. The goal is that they'll continue to set out the ARUs, collect the data. The ARUs have AI on board that helps with the filtering and reporting of that data real time. And then we'll load the data sets, run them through our pipelines, and be able to give some distilled results back to the management team. And they use that to inform the management of wolves within Yellowstone. But now we're also going outside of the borders into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as well. So we're working with private partners like Turner Endangered Species Fund and some of the Ted Turner's amazing ranch lands that he's been using to protect wolves for generations. So we'll continue kind of focusing on this idea that De-Extinction spins out all these iterative technologies that we can apply to amazing conservation projects around the world, and really show that you should focus more on conservation or de-extinction, is that the two are intrinsically linked and that one helps drive the other.
We as a society and we as humanity are losing a pretty important fight, right? When we started Colossal, it was forecasted by external scientists that we could lose up to 15%, 15% of all species between now and 2050. It's now as high as 50. Some argue that it's 40, some argue that it's 50, but regardless, that's not a very good trend line for 15% to 50%. And so one of the things that we're very passionate about at Colossal is not only open sourcing our technologies for conservation use, but also ensuring that we're working on these specific projects like with Yellowstone and wolves. But one of the things that sometimes I think that is missed when people talk about Colossal is that they think of it as an or, right? It's like, oh, we need to be conserving land and protecting species or doing this. And it's really an and, right? We know that current conservation works. It's just not working at the speed at which we're changing the planet and eradicating species. And so we are not ever asking, people to say, oh, don't conserve land, don't go work on existing conservation models. Keep doing that. And you should spend 99% of your time doing that. But spend 1% of your time building redundancy models and building backup plans, right? Because, I don't want to live in a world and I don't want my kids to live in a world that, has a massive ecosystem collapse due to loss of biodiversity. And that is the world that we are all heading towards.
Is there a lot of pushback on that? Because I've heard critics who argue that this de-extinction concept reduces the urgency of conservation, since some species can quote unquote be brought back later. So have you felt that pushback?
Yeah, I mean, we hear it sometimes, but you've got critics, and then you have uninformed critics. So I think the second category is where we hear that pushback is uninformed critics. And so that's the job that I think we have at Colossal, is to educate people and be like, look, we need to keep doing what we're doing because it is much better to save a species than to bring back a species. This is not an alternative, but we do need to also give some idea of hope, inspire the ideological thinking of making new technologies, and also letting the world have at least some semblance of a backup plan. Because if everything else fails and all we have is de-extinction, 50 years from now, that's gonna be a terrible world, right? And I'm saying that from the seat as of a CEO of the only de-extinction company. I don't want that world, right? Because it is costly, and even if we get it massively more effective, it's going to be very, very hard, and we're going to have to make select decisions on what can be brought back to save an ecosystem because it's on the brink of collapse. And that's not a world that any of us in the world, I think, wants to live in, especially even at Colossal. And so we will get that pushback. I think we're going to continue to get that pushback, but anytime you do something that's new or different, sometimes it's scary, right? Like there was a time where people argued that seatbelts were scary and they didn't want to put them in cars because it made people feel like cars were scary. But we all know that seatbelts save lives. So this is a multi-decade journey, and transparency and education just falls on our shoulders as we go through it.
And these are the same arguments that were, levied against things like biobanking when that idea was coming up 50 years ago and really started to focus 20, 30 years ago. People said, well, if you have these animals on ice, why should people care if they're existing in nature? And then they were levied against captive breeding programs and assisted reproductive technologies. Well, if you can just start producing animals more and more in a captive situation, why should we protect them in the wild? And what we've seen over time is those have become very conventional tools for conservationists today. I think what's also missed in that argument is the idea that de-extinction acts as a beacon of a hope, as a driver of interest into conservation. I just look at the trip Beth and I took last year to Mauritius, where we met with the people of Mauritius, the government, the NGOs, and we talked about bringing back the dodo. And the first question that almost all of them had is, where should it go and how can we protect more land for the dodo? So it became this driver of interest in habitat restoration, habitat protections, removing invasive species, which would be typically conventional conservation effort. Now we're being able to bring more people to the table, while at the same time bringing more funding, more technology, all the things that we need. Because, the Paulson Institute did a great study about 3-4 years ago that showed in order to reverse the biodiversity crisis we face today, globally, we need to spend about $900 billion a year. On average, every year we spend about $180 billion. So that means every year we fall $720 billion short of reversing the biodiversity crisis. That means two things. We need new ideas that bring new funding to the table, and we need new ideas that improve the efficiency and effectiveness of conservation to make it a cheaper endeavor.
So we touched a little bit on the issue of ethics, and I want to come back to it a little bit. I mean, clearly in the genomics world, we're heading towards a revolution, and it is supported by computational methods. And it's always the case that as humans, we're lagging behind technology. Technology comes and then we try to figure out what impact it has on us. You are in the midst of this and you're dealing with ethical issues. So what kind of education and principles can you provide that will prepare us for what will come in the future in this, what I consider a revolution?
I think that it's important to highlight that, as we make these decisions, we don't make them in a moral vacuum and we don't make them in a regulatory vacuum. And we are sitting in the midst of international groups of people that all have different ways of thinking about how we as people should be interacting with nature. We often get the question phrased, is this playing God as the main sort of ethical challenge to us? And one of the things that our ethical advisor, Alta Chara, likes to point out is that this is a very sort of Christian-centric way of viewing things, and it views this as if we are somehow violating this interaction that we have with this God, but that there are other cultures out there who actually see a responsibility that is shared between a creator and people to make sure that the world is taken care of in a certain way. And so we can't really tell other people how they should feel about this, but we can help people to explore the possibilities that are created when we move into these technologies and these tools. Often another thing that we get is this idea that doing nothing is somehow safer. Doing nothing is somehow the more moral or the more ethical approach to this. But it's important to remember that doing nothing is a decision, an active decision that we are making that has consequences that we understand. And those consequences are that we will continue to see this increased rate of extinction, much of it due to the way that people have decided we're going to interact with the rest of the world. We as humans have been manipulating the evolutionary trajectories of the species that we interact with since we've existed. We took gray wolves and turned them into chihuahuas and Great Danes and teosinte, and turn that into sweet corn and all the different varieties that we have today. We rely on humans making decisions for other species for pretty much all of the things that we live with, that we consume. And when we think of conservation now, often people think of it as very hands-off. But in conservation, even, we are making the decisions about who gets to live, how many get to breed, which ones get to breed, whether they're vaccinated, where they get to live, etc. We are an evolutionary force, and we need to figure out how we're going to wield the power that we have in a way that people are comfortable with. And that means people of all sorts of different cultural and ethical and moral backgrounds. And this is an important conversation to be having while we are in the midst of developing these tools.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode of Data Nation with the MIT Institute for Data Systems and Society. You can learn more about IDSS and listen to previous episodes at our website, idss.mit.edu, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our producers, Tina Toby Mack, and assistant producers, Ben Stoll and Maria Burks. Don't forget to leave us a review and follow our Twitter at MIT IDSS to stay informed. Thanks again for listening to MIT's Data Nation.